All right. So, congratulations if you survived 3 hours of tedium hosted by our benevolent friends at ABC News. It actually wasn't quite 3 hours. I'm a little surprised that ABC didn't milk it for all it was worth. They seemed to cut short the debate 15 minutes early. Maybe even they were bored by it. But nonetheless, I did watch the entire thing. I tried to stay focused, but for even somebody like me who follows this stuff day in and day out, you can't help but find your mind wandering. Where I'm almost sitting there imagining beautiful waterfalls, children playing, animals frolicking, anything other than these charades. But wanted to give a little bit of a reaction. Obviously, Tulsi was not on the stage, and the absence was, I think, well noted, at least on social media. Although the main people noting it tend, and from what I saw, tends to be conservatives. Partially because liberals who are partisans have a vested interest in constricting the range of acceptable debate because they feel as though too many people lobbing too many bombs and causing too much friction is somehow bad for party unity or some such platitudes. So, because of the infinite wisdom of the DNC, we had a non-entity like Amy Klobuchar up there talking for the 8 millionth time about how she has these impressive Midwestern roots and basically saying nothing of substance while Tulsi was off at home or wherever she might be tonight, not leveling a foreign policy critique. And interestingly, Kamala Harris was asked a question that was basically just a reiteration of the attack that Tulsi successfully mounted against Kamala at the last debate, which distilled into, if you're such a principled champion of criminal justice reform now, why, when you were in a position of power to actually effectuate such reform, did you not do so? That's what Tulsi, in essence, said at the last debate. And one of the moderators asked Kamala basically another version of that question, which I think underscored the necessity of that question or of that argument when Tulsi first raised it. Some other thoughts. I just wrote a quick reaction piece for The Spectator. I'm not sure if it's up yet, so I might be toggling back and forth between my messages here to see if it's up. But basically, probably one of the most remarked upon moments was when Biden got in a dig at Bernie for being a socialist. Now, I didn't think the dig was particularly substantive, but it is notable in the sense that when Bernie ran in 2016, Hillary didn't really have much reason to attack him vociferously throughout that campaign. It would have been seen as kind of lowering her standing to really get deep into the mud with Bernie. I mean, they did have some instances in which there was a contentious back and forth, but Hillary, as far as I can recall, correct me if I'm wrong, never really attacked him on the socialism point. Part because she wanted to sort of placate him and bring his supporters into the fold, which didn't exactly work, but that's what she was trying to do. And this, I believe, was the first time that Bernie had really been challenged on the socialism label on a national stage. Now, is Biden the best messenger for that? Probably not, because he can barely stumble through a sentence most of the time. But it's especially it could be salient because if you look at Democratic polling polling with among Democratic primary voters, consistently their top issue is electability or some version of that. And if you have the former vice president and maybe some other candidates questioning whether a self-described socialist is electable, you could see that concentrating the minds not of Bernie's most ardent support base, but of like a different section of the Democratic electorate who could be potentially convinced to support Bernie, but now if the socialism label is more in the ether, it might give them pause. So that's a little bit of a notable development. Again, not saying that Biden is a compelling messenger for that critique, but nonetheless, that's it was probably one of the more notable moments. The reason the DNC that the DNC has rigged the primary is because Bernie couldn't even get a glass of water, so he had like a frog in his throat the entire time. I was suggesting that somebody rush him out some hot water with lemon, and that didn't seem to happen. I don't think anybody particularly cares about how clear Bernie's voice sounds, but it was a little bit distracting. What else? I mean, just in a general sense, I think the lack of emphasis on foreign policy in these debates is illustrative of a misunderstanding of what the president actually does. So the presidency over the course of decades has accrued more and more unilateral power over the domain of foreign policy. If you are president, you can, in essence, do whatever you want in the foreign policy arena. Now, that's not what was contemplated by the Constitution, and there are many reasons to criticize that consolidation of power in the presidency, but that is the state of play for presidents. So whether it's military action or sanctions or diplomatic initiatives, whatever the case may be, all of that is like within the direct personal purview of the president. So for these debates to only have like a 15-minute segment on foreign policy each time over 3 hours, again, it neglects what power the president actually wields. And domestic issues are important too. I would not deny that, but that's where Congress actually has a role. And in a sense, Congress is more important on the domestic policy making front than the president. But the same obviously cannot be said for foreign policy. And so it should, I think, offend everybody's sensibility that moderators relegate foreign policy to afterthought status. And if you're lucky, you get about 10 minutes on it. George Stephanopoulos could have pressed Biden on his Iraq war statements, for instance. Biden continues to maintain that he was opposed somehow to the Iraq war. I published a piece yesterday in a video on how Biden told me personally. He said to me last Friday that he was against the Iraq war before it began, which is just almost too gross a distortion for me to capture in words here, because it's beyond untrue. And Bernie Bernie brings up the fact that Biden voted for the war, which is true. He voted to authorize it, but there's more to say there. I mean, Biden didn't just vote to authorize it; he helped to furnish the talking points that the Bush administration used to justify the invasion. And in so doing, he, along with other of his colleagues in the Senate, such as Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, etc., both of whom happened to be presidential nominees as well, they gave bipartisan credence to the Bush administration's designs. And so it's not just a matter of the vote. It's a matter of how Biden has characterized the vote and is claiming including to me personally, again, that notwithstanding that vote, he opposed the war, which is just not true. You can go find all kinds of contemporaneous statements in 2002, 2003, where Biden is vociferous in his support of the war effort, even if he might have had some procedural qualms around the margins. As Bernie pointed out, if you had opposed the war, you could have done a few simple things, like saying, I oppose the war, voting against the war, campaigning against the war, all of which Bernie did. And Biden did not do. So for him to really skate away or skate by without serious, sustained criticism on that point is a joke. It's not like it's ancient history. This was 16 years ago. And Biden has never really had his position on the issue thoroughly vetted, because in 2007-8, when he ran the last time, he was not regarded as a major candidate. So there wasn't a whole lot of interrogation of his views on that subject. I'm sure you could find a couple examples here and there, but never really in a high profile way. Hillary was the one who rightly got that negative attention then. And I don't think even she claimed that she opposed the war before it started. But Biden is now doing that. So he's kind of he's increasing the scope of the revisionism. And he brought it up again tonight, but there was no opportunity, given the structure of the debate, to really challenge it. And, the structure of these debates, you can't help but be bored by them. Remember that the object of these debates, and the reason why the DNC and, frankly, the RNC, the reason why the party apparatuses delegate such control over these debates to the TV networks is because they're all in the same peer group. They're all friends and colleagues, and they like the idea that the purpose behind how the networks run these debates is to maximize viewership. And you maximize viewership not by facilitating actual debate, although they kind of pretend to do that. You do it by just making it an entertaining spectacle. And that often means that the spectacle is divorced from any real substance. And then people will, there's sort of like a narrative building that Biden was challenged on his cognitive capabilities. Castro brought that up during the debate, suggesting that Biden forgot a comment he had made about whether his healthcare program is optional or has an automatic buy-in or something to that effect. But, I haven't looked that deeply into it, but it looks as though Castro misrepresented what Biden said, which is just like, if you can't even go after Biden on his mental acuity, if you screw that up, wow, you're really screwed, because that's the easiest thing in the world to go after. All you have to do is listen to the guy and find 10 million examples of him showing diminished cognitive aptitude. So for Castro to screw up, to flub that, that's almost a bigger flub than anything Biden could do. So that's embarrassing. One thing I said during the gun violence section was that made sort of a tongue-in-cheek comment that, the end of the republic will come with President Beto instituting a mandatory gun confiscation program. And of course, a bunch of liberal trolls and Democratic partisan hack idiots, try to accuse me of being a tough guy and wanting to suggest that I'm personally going to lead an armed rebellion against the government if they try to take my guns. No, I'm not invested in gun culture. I don't own guns, and I have no emotional stake in gun ownership per se, but I have at least the awareness to recognize that millions and millions of my fellow citizens are invested and are very emotionally attached to their guns. So there are reasonable policy reforms around guns that I think are worth debating. But this notion that forcibly confiscating guns, is going to be something that can be done peaceably, meaning you get criminally penalized if you don't comply with the federal government's mandatory gun confiscation program. How is that ever going to be implemented in a way that doesn't result in huge societal discord and probably violence? That's a fantasy. That's a fantasy if you have even minimal familiarity with the nature of gun ownership in the US. So I'm not against all gun control. I'm not against all reform initiatives that might address some of the marginal issues around dangerous people possessing guns. But Beto running around screaming that he's going to literally take your guns, meaning he's going to institute a mandatory gun confiscation program, that's a recipe for major, major societal disruption, and again, most likely violence. Can bands of little self-identified militia members or whatever meaningfully combat that? Probably not. And I think some of the ideology around people who think that their gun ownership makes them, resistors of the oppressive state is a little overblown, to say the least. But at the same time, mandatory gun confiscation, really? You think that's a winning issue? Come on. Thank you for the nice comments. No, somebody asked, no Tom Steyer. Tom Steyer didn't qualify for this debate, but he will be on the debate stage next month. So get ready for Steyer-mentum. Get ready to be blown away by Steyer's amazing policy prescriptions for how America can be better. Because he will be on there, and he proves that if you're a billionaire in the U.S., you can do almost anything, including purchasing yourself a spot on the debate stage. Because that's essentially what he did. What else? Give me a moment here. I have some notes that I compiled. Jorge Ramos is awful. He's criminally overrated, and there's this idea that he's like this bold adversarial journalist holding power to account, when really he does is just ask annoying questions that don't have a whole lot of substantive basis. And the most egregious example of that tonight was the question that he posed to Bernie about Venezuela. Now, do I think Venezuela is an important issue? Yeah, but it's an important issue mostly because the U.S. has been trying to overthrow its government. Hello? Did you miss that? Did you miss that the U.S. has been sponsoring a coup attempt since January of this year? And virtually nobody in the political class, Tulsi being an exception, has said anything critical about it, or has challenged the fundamental premise of whether the U.S. should be involved in essentially a regime change effort in Venezuela. So it's amazing to me that Jorge Ramos could be asking questions about Venezuela without even mentioning that there has been major U.S. government resources deployed to overthrowing the government. Like, that would be the one thing that you think would be most relevant to discuss at a debate about Venezuela. But Jorge Ramos decided to basically just put his own little spin on the cheap, reflexive Republican talking point that says that all notions of socialism are conflated with Venezuela, which is just, even if you're against socialism, that's so lazy. And it doesn't reflect any kind of robust understanding of what socialism could actually consist of in the United States, or how it manifests in the rest of the world. So rather than go down that stupid rabbit hole, I don't know. I think the fact that the U.S. has been trying to overthrow that government would be a more salient issue to discuss. And, Bernie he kind of took the bait and he didn't address it either. He kind of just rattled off the talking points about how Maduro is a tyrant or whatever, and also forgot to mention that Maduro has been the U.S. has been trying to force Maduro's ouster. Now, whether he's a tyrant or not is almost immaterial. The question is, what is the U.S. government's posture? That is most relevant to what the president does. Your personal feelings are kind of less important about any particular world leader. And the U.S. has been trying to engineer a coup in Venezuela, but Jorge Ramos didn't bring it up. Bernie didn't bring it up, and Castro didn't bring it up. Those are, I believe, the only three candidates who address Venezuela. Biden tried to bring it up like on an offhand way, and he ended up calling Maduro Madura. So, Biden kind of stresses how familiar he is with world leaders, but he can't even pronounce their names correctly. So I guess my joke was Madura. I hardly knew ya. Yeah, Jorge Ramos was like, he was detained in Venezuela and like used that to make a big splash about how oppressive Maduro is, and there are plenty of legitimate criticisms one might raise about Maduro. I'm not denying that, but I'm saying in the context of a presidential primary debate, obviously the biggest policy issue at stake is whether the U.S. should be seeking to overthrow the government. And the media and the candidates, to some extent, are oblivious to that, evidently. There was one interesting moment I thought from Booker. I mean, I think Booker tries to almost act as though through the sheer force of his passion, he is going to get all this stuff done. Now, I don't think that's a compelling theory of change. The idea that if you emote sufficiently vigorously, that means you can attain all these policy reforms that you advocate. But there's a little bit of a cheap shot question to him about his veganism. And he kind of, like, as though Booker's advocating that everybody make the same choice that he does in terms of his not eating any animal products. And I thought his answer is actually somewhat sound on that, where he kind of formulated it into a criticism of factory farming, which almost never gets discussed on the national stage. And factory farming is only as prevalent as it is due to government subsidy. So it's directly irrelevant to federal policy. So I thought that was actually deft on Booker's part. But at the same time, just in general, this idea that Booker seems to present that if he just exhibits his passion enough, and if he uses enough sweeping, grandiose rhetoric, he's going to, take the country by storm. I don't know that theory of political change has really been established, given recent history. The Afghanistan section was a little shallow, but Warren did pledge that she would bring U.S. troops home, even absent a, quote, deal with the Taliban, which is notable because there seems to be this fallacy out there that you need to have a deal with the Taliban in order to withdraw, which of course is not true. I mean, the U.S. invaded with no deal. You might recall that. And it could simply get up and leave tomorrow if it wanted to. So the idea that a deal is a prerequisite to withdrawal has kind of become this excuse or this self-imposed arbitrary obstacle to actually instituting a withdrawal, and kind of gives everybody an out so that they don't actually have to commit to withdrawing troops. Like Trump could withdraw troops from Afghanistan tomorrow, and in a sense, that would be even preferable to having a deal because let's say I quote the deal is violated in 6 months or a year or whenever. That means you're going to resend troops back in because the Taliban, by your lights, violated some deal. No, I mean, if you reject the premise of the U.S. having a sustained military combat presence in Afghanistan for this long, then that shouldn't be contingent on whether a deal is had. That should be something that unto itself is necessary with or without a deal. So that I thought was notable from Warren. I couldn't help but ponder the absence of Marianne Williamson as well. I pictured her sitting in a quiet room somewhere, quiet, perhaps meditating, perhaps summoning the dark psychic forces to undermine her rivals. No, I'm sure she didn't do that, but I am sort of curious about how Mary Williamson or really any of the other candidates would spend a night like this. Do they actually sit there and watch the debate? Is it too painful for them? Don't know. Marianne maybe had a debate with herself or a debate with metaphysical forces. Some people are saying that Tulsi is going to make it in the next debate. That's no guarantee. She had several polls just this week that theoretically would have been qualifying, one of which was in New Hampshire, where she was ahead of count them, 5 candidates who have qualified for the debates. So there was a poll published by Franklin Pierce University and the Boston Herald, which had Tulsi ahead. Beto, Booker, Yang. Wait, maybe not Yang. Beto, Booker, Klobuchar, Castro, and Steyer. 5 candidates who have qualified for the debates, but wouldn't you know it, that poll was not deemed qualifying. And then there was another CNN national poll with Tulsi at 2%. But shocker, that one doesn't count either, because you know why? This is even more arcane and pointless and illogical. Because another qualifying poll that Tulsi has, she has 2, was a CNN national poll. So what the DNC has decreed is that you cannot have another CNN national poll count toward your debate qualifying total. And so she's still stuck at 2. But Steyer will be there, so there you go. There's during the part about these debates have just like, it seems like now mandatory that there just has to be a generic question about racism at these debates, which is, okay, a legitimate issue, but wouldn't you want the question to be a little more targeted? Wouldn't you want the question to have some direct bearing on a concrete policy proposal that could address whatever racist inequity you are claiming exists? I just don't really see the utility in asking a Biden, for instance, to just pronounce on the legacy of slavery like we're sitting in a history class or something. It seems like a pander on the part of the moderators, and it's an invitation to the candidates to simply, I don't like using the word virtue signal because it's become a cliche, but just emote about how seriously they take the topic without connecting it to anything specific that a president could do while in office. A president could, one of the powers that is not wielded enough, I don't think, by presidents is the pardon power, the commutation power. So you could get them to commit to pardoning nonviolent drug offenders or even violent drug offenders. That would reduce racial discrepancies in a way that is actually within the direct purview of the president. So I would prefer a tailored question on that rather than, racism is bad, what are you going to do about it? Which is just like there are a million answers to that question. And, it even has a foreign policy dimension, which of course goes generally under emphasized because, if you bomb non-white people, that's not indicative of racism per the normal discourse. But I wouldn't expect people with the with people with the great intellectual prowess of Jorge Ramos or a George Stephanopoulos to really be cognizant of that. Okay. Some people were asking me about Yang. The thing about Yang is like whenever he's talking about an issue other than the universal basic income, he kind of just seems like almost like a generic Democrat. I mean, do you get that impression? The universal basic income obviously is unique to him, and he can talk about that compellingly. But most of the time, it seems like when he's talking about anything else, it's really just boilerplate that you could hear from almost any Democrat whose name you could pick out of a hat. Especially on foreign policy, I just don't think Yang distinguishes himself at all from the others. And again, like I've been emphasizing, that's the one area over which the president has the most unilateral control. Yang may wish that he as president, could automatically institute $1,000 a month for every citizen. But sorry, buddy, that's got to go through Congress. And I don't know how Mitch McConnell feels about that. There was one interesting moment where Bernie was asked about the filibuster, and he reiterated his longstanding position, which is that he's against abolishing the filibuster. He seems to claim that major, like climate change and gun control legislation or whatever else, can be passed through a budget reconciliation process. I don't think that's true, but it's interesting because Bernie's opposition to abolishing the filibuster is sort of reflective of a tendency within him that you don't hear much about, and is a little bit at odds with his popular image, which is that he is something of an institutionalist within the context of the Senate, meaning he reveres certain Senate norms and congressional structures, which I think is not surprising given that he's been in Congress since 1991. But you don't see that side of him much because he's seen as a rabble rouser or whatever, or somebody who's going to marshal a popular uprising to implement his policy initiatives, which he may well do. But in tandem with that is this continued commitment to Senate, in particular customs, and that's not something that you hear about Bernie much. What else? Is there a candidate who I didn't talk about? Mentioned Castro failing to criticize Biden on his cognitive aptitude, which was an incredible failure on Castro's part. Mentioned Beto wanting to take all the guns. Mentioned Kamala being attacked by proxy by Tulsi, because the question posed to Kamala from the moderator was just basically a rehash of what Tulsi said at the last debate. By the way, do you notice that whenever Kamala is confronted about something or asked a difficult question, she finds a way to laugh in a creepy way? Like she finds it funny that her record is questioned or something. It's a sort of a deflection tactic. You laugh, you kind of divert attention to what it is you were asked about. She used a few canned lines about what was it, like the man behind Trump is the equivalent of the Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain or whatever. He's a little dude in there, and the lamest laugh line I thought was Klobuchar saying, "Houston, we have a problem." Really, like, and that's that's what you came up with. That was the fruit. Those were the fruits of your strategy sessions with your advisors. Houston, we have a problem. Wow, you're in Houston, and then you remember to use the one line about Houston that everybody knows. Congratulations. Let's see. I think that about does it. All right, people. Somebody asked me, what do you think of Castro implying that Biden was senile? I just addressed that. Castro didn't even have an effective criticism of Biden's senility, because what Castro ended up doing was mischaracterize something that Biden had said. So if you want to go after Biden about his senility, be prepared so that you can't, it doesn't boomerang on you, and you actually engender sympathy for Biden, which he doesn't deserve, right? So I thought that fell flat. I saw Booker said something in one of the post-debate interviews where he said, like, some of us wonder about Biden when we hear him meandering through thoughts and talking and such, talking with basically not being clear in what he says. So, I mean, I think that narrative is going to keep growing. You saw Tim Ryan last weekend, who's obviously not in the debates, but he said that something to the effect of, like, people don't think Biden's got the stamina to do this and doesn't seem all with it. You know, especially if Biden's at the top of the polls within a week or two, I think you're going to hear more and more of that. Probably whispers among advisors and such. All right, people. Have a good night. Talk to you all later.